Well, this is the video podcast for Theofantastique. I should say the occasional video podcast. I don't do a whole lot of these whenever a good opportunity presents itself, and today we have that. I'm John Moorhead of Theofantastique, and my guest is Matthew William Brake. And I'm going to read your bio from the Pop Culture and Theology website here, and you can fill in any blanks you want. Matthew Brake is the creator and founder of Pop Culture and Theology. He has a dual master. He is a dual master student in interdisciplinary studies and philosophy at George Mason University. He also has a Master of Divinity from Regent University. He has published numerous articles in the series Kierkegaard Research Sources, Reception. I'm sorry, gosh, I flubbed that word. Kierkegaard Research Sources, Reception, Resources. There we go. He has chapters in Deadpool and Philosophy, Wonder Woman and Philosophy, and Mr. Robot in Philosophy. So you've been a busy guy. Matthew, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. And I have to throw in a correction on my bio. I finally am out of that master's program. I'm graduated.
Okay.
Done. So I officially have those two masters. They're under the belt, and hopefully I'll be able to trade them in for a PhD. It's sort of like a Pokemon situation. You have to catch them all.
Is that how it works? You could trade those in?
I'm hoping.
Okay. All right. Well, let me know. Keep me posted on that. So you're just guilty of not updating your bio on the website.
Totally guilty.
Gotcha. Well, before we talk about some of the things, the projects you're involved in, the website and so on, how did you get involved in this particular area? It's somewhat niche. You know, I'm in the area too. What's your personal background? What was it that brought you into studying philosophy, theology, and pop culture?
Well, my journey into theology started when I was raised a Christian, and then had a conversion experience when I was 13, got really passionate about Jesus. Before that, I do want to say I was growing up super nerdy, super geeky. I discovered Star Trek: The Next Generation at a very young age. I have all sorts of toys and stuff in my dad's attic from all the different phases I went through. So I've always been sort of a nerd, always sort of a collector. The last thing I was really nerdy about before I really got passionate about my faith was Star Wars. And then there was something about my conversion where I just sort of felt like I could only be nerdy about Jesus. And so I was all into the Jesus thing. And then so for a long time I had no hobbies other than church and my spiritual life. But then gradually over time, when I was in college, I began to pick up those philosophy and pop culture books. Like they had just started coming out, The Matrix, superheroes, all these others. And I enjoyed them as much for the ideas as the stories they were summarizing.
Mm-hmm,
and so I began to sort of rediscover my nerdiness, occasionally reading. I think the first comic book I read in years in 2003 was Kingdom Come by Alex Ross and Mark Waid, which is a great, beautiful story. And even with theology and philosophy, you had these dual tracks of my inherent nerdiness and the questions I was asking about my faith were after the initial conversion experience in that year of I love Jesus, you start to ask really tough questions. Mm-hmm. And it kind of takes you down the rabbit hole, either into irrationalism or trying to find ways to justify your faith. And
right.
And then you either become a conspiracy theorist or you end up becoming a scholar, I guess. And so later on down the road, I started to, the thing that got me back into my nerdy habits was I played Batman Arkham City. A friend of mine left it at my house. I played through it. I started at 8 in the morning and played through till 6 in the morning the next day. Just the straight marathon of playing this game. Was looking at all the Easter eggs. And so I finally went back and started buying comics again. I started buying graphic novels and trades, which got me into the whole comic scene. And at first I was sort of timid about it, but then I began to embrace my nerdy cultureness. It helped that, around that time, the Avengers was just coming out. And so superheroes were taking the world by storm. And but through that, I began to resuscitate all my old nerdy interests, Star Wars, Trek. And I had this idea for an article. I began to revisit the Pop Culture and Philosophy series, and I had this idea for an article on Jewish election. and the Bajorans, and was going to try to write something about, like, not even just Jewish election, but the idea of election. And I was like, I wonder if there's a call for papers for Star Trek and philosophy. So I looked it up, and I missed the call by a week. But I began to blog for the And Philosophy blog, for the Blackwell series. I began to submit chapters for them and for the Open Court series that originated that whole trend. And then I began to realize I had all these theological ideas too I wanted to talk about, and there was no ongoing series that did for philosophy, or excuse me, that did for religion what like you had for philosophy, and even history and psychology and even science. And so I began to think about, I sat on that for a few years, and then I had a friend who encouraged me, you should start your own website. You should pitch a book series. And so I did. And back in AAR in 2017, I had a friend at Fortress who was like, hey, if you want to pitch some books, come talk to me. So I did, and he directed me to Lexington, and that, as they say, is that. And so that's sort of the short story about how all those issues of faith and nerdiness coincided.
And the rest is history.
The rest is history.
Well, it's interesting to hear, a little personal aside here, interesting to hear your, I don't know if you would characterize it as a struggle when you were trying to reconcile your faith with your nerd interests. I went through something similar in that I had been a fan prior to any kind of conversion, but not only of science fiction and fantasy, but also of horror, which, as you know, is far more difficult to reconcile, at least that's the perception, with conservative Christian commitments than other forms of genre. And so I was a fan of that, got converted into a very conservative Christian community. And I actually left that. I thought, well, that's incompatible. I just can't go there anymore. But I encountered some academic books on, exploring the religious and theological themes. And I thought, why is it? I mean, this is an unfounded assumption. And I picked it up again and started running with it with a gusto. And the result is you and I having this conversation here today. So it's interesting to hear, some kind of similar. Was it a conservative religious community you were a part of? Was that part of the struggle for you?
Yeah, I mean, and it was Pentecostal, and I love my Pentecostal back. I love the idea that maybe God still does weird stuff. Like I love that whole idea. Tony Campolo has this great quote where he's like, "I want a God I can feel," and that always stuck with me when I heard it years ago. And but I was also occasionally I'd have to like put my nerd interest aside for like comics and X-Men or whatever, because you had speakers like there's this one woman, Carol Kornacki, who her, according to her testimony, she was like a witch and into all this witchcraft stuff. Then she converted. Mm-hmm. And she had this one talk she would give about how, and she would always hold up a Wolverine figure about how, there are only two sources of power in the world, right. God and the devil. So where does Wolverine's powers come from?
Surprised it wasn't Doctor Strange she held up.
It's funny, at the time, like that was like, this was the 90s. So the X-Men, this was like the Jim Lee Image Revolution era. So it's like you had all the X-Men toys after X-Men #1 launched. And so they were really, so it was low hanging fruit. But she would also talk about video games, like any nerdy interest basically was right. Demonic because of how they depicted power and violence and all these other things. But I love what you say about horror. And it's funny you mentioned that, because I was thinking, the person who got me thinking, like, I'm not really into horror, but I have an interest in exploring it more, mainly because Scott Derrickson, who did Doctor Strange.
Yeah. Yep.
I guess his background is in horror, and he has this great quote about horror being used to start spiritual conversations in a disenchanted world. And so that's something I struggle with, because a lot of the comics I read are by like people who are self-proclaimed magicians, like Alan Moore and Grant Morrison. Mm-hmm. And like, on the one hand, I get the issue there biblically, theologically, but in a disenchanted world, like, for me, those are tools to get people thinking about the world as an enchanted place, where a spiritual place And from it's almost like how some thinkers talk about how you need to go through paganism to get to Christianity. Like you need that enchanting world.
Yeah.
Um, Once you've disenchanted the world so much, God is no longer a live option.
Yeah, I recently posted a quote from Guillermo del Toro that I've had on my blog for quite a while. An interview he gave in USA Today. To me, he's fascinating. Full disclosure, I edited a book on his work, but he's just fascinating. A former raised by a stern Catholic grandmother, has since rejected his Catholicism and Christian worldview, and yet, as Doug Cowan says, we can leave a religion, but we can't escape the religious imagination. And so I posted a quote where he said in this interview that comics and fantasy and horror are the only tools that we have for a generation that has rejected religion and dogma to talk about spiritual things. And I think he's precisely right. And for years in my own mind, I wrestled, which do I like more, science fiction or horror? And I hate to choose one over the other. And I really wrestled with this until one day it just dawned on me. I really love the visceral aspect of horror, the fact that it does so readily connect with not just religious ideas and theology, but ethics and questions of meaning and purpose. And it's answered variously, but the fact that that genre creates a context for you to wrestle with those things, I had to go with horror, but science fiction is a, a close second. But yeah, so.
It's funny you talk about that. I had a friend who a number of years ago, and this is me advertising a book I didn't do, and I'm happy to do that. It's a book edited by a guy named Amos Yong, but it has an essay in it from my friend Donnie. I think it's some like Pentecostal interdisciplinary studies, something like that. And Donnie wrote this chapter on Stephen King's The Shining and the whole aspect of what he calls the pneumokinetic. That what unsettles us in The Shining is the moment when the latch turns, where Jack Nicholson is locked, is locked in the room, and all of a sudden the latch turns. Because up until then, it could all be psychological, but with the pneumokinetic, we now have an invasion of the spiritual world into our world, and that's the unsettling aspect. It's really cool. I mean, if you haven't checked it out, you'd probably
No,
really enjoy it.
No, I'd like to. Yeah. Well, let me steer us back now that I've led us down a little rabbit trail there. Let's talk about your great website, Pop Culture and Theology. How did that come about? How long has it been around?
It's been around since 2017. I think spring-ish 2017. I bought the domain in I think April that year. I had a friend who had been encouraging me to start my own blog because I was blogging a lot for the Blackwell Pop Culture and Philosophy site with William Irwin, who sort of, in some ways, I think he founded the Open Court series too. So in some ways, it was Bill who, he started the Open Court series and then he started the Blackwell series. So I was doing a lot of stuff with him and really appreciated his work and was blogging a lot. But my friend, I had a buddy who's also my pastor. We're part of a little house church together. He was like, "You should really start something of your own. Why not start a theology and pop culture?" And he kept pushing me on it, and I kept wanting to delay. I was like, I should wait till I'm out of school or I have more time. But he pushed me on it and was like, "No, you should go ahead and do this now." And so I did, and I began to seek writers from my social circle, and was joining all sorts of Facebook groups and doing the thing that if you have a Facebook group, you always hate when someone sort of like not spams, but kind of spams their own blog entries. I started a Twitter account. I wrote up a form letter because one of the things I wanted to do was make sure that these blogs were popular, but written by not only scholars. And I also say I want practitioners and other thoughtful people to write, but with a scholar, you at least know it's going to have some meat to it potentially. And so I wrote up a form letter with my friend who sort of co-founded it with me at the time, and then I just started making email lists of like I went state by state and looked up every college in the state and would go to their religious studies departments and just send this form letter. Like, "Dear Professor so-and-so." And for the most part, I only got probably 2 nasty replies. One was, "Your idea is stupid, theology sucks." And the other was, this one Bart scholar at Princeton who actually he wasn't mean, but he was sort of like, hey, how did you get my email? So I did that. I did the entire Northeast. I did Alaska, Hawaii, I think Texas. I think I stopped at Delaware when it started to get more momentum. And so yeah, I was just trying to get people to contribute. And for the most part, I think I've only had like 6, 7 weeks maybe where I've had to skip a week for lack of content. So it's been good.
Wow, that's awesome. I didn't know it had only been there since 2017. So if you go out there and look at it, it looks like it's been there for a while. You got a lot of content and a lot of good content. So as someone who's been blogging for a while and now I just blog whenever the mood strikes or a good idea comes along. When I first created the blog, I was like, I had to do at least 2 posts a week. That was my goal, and it was killing me because I was the only one providing content. But so I know what it's like to try and keep something like that going. So that's great. I encourage people. We'll include in the text that accompanies this, we'll include a link so folks can take a look at it. Now you've got some series of books that you're working on. We'll talk about those. The first one is Theology and Pop Culture. What's the main thrust behind that? You got a variety of topics, but what are you trying to accomplish there?
Yeah. Well, with everything I do, I kind of, per our earlier conversation, with all this theology and pop culture stuff, per that Guillermo del Toro quote, my goal is in some ways, I often say, to re-enchant the world. So my goal was to start a critical, interdenominational, interreligious series, because with all of that, there's something for everyone in there. There's hopefully stuff in there that people will find feeds their own spiritual life. There's stuff that will teach you about the traditions of others. There's potential for some comparative theology in there where you can learn from another tradition lessons that can apply to your own. It's still heavily Christian dominated. And some of that's my background. And so I do want to diversify that a little bit more. The goal being multi-faith, not interfaith, as some might say, recognizing religious difference and not being ashamed about that. But yeah, my goal is in some ways religious learning for, as we've talked about, a time in history and a generation that is disenchanted, where religion isn't a live option. I want to get people having these conversations again. So the goal is to explore any aspect of pop culture that anyone's willing to do. I obviously have the topic books that kind of range from something broader like something like science fiction and theology. I want books like that are, and actually I think the publisher actually wants books like that are more broad, like horror and theology, which is one of the books which is a book you're doing with Brandon. And then I have ones that are more artifact specific. So something like, I don't have one for this yet, but I have someone who might want to do it. The Good Place, for instance, or Black Mirror, things like that. And then a body of work by a particular person, someone like Stanley Kubrick. I have a potential thing happening there in the future, hopefully. And that one thing I would like to do, theology, on the theology side of this, is have specific thinkers that get addressed in pop culture. So like someone like Rene Girard and pop culture. We have a volume under contract, and then Kierkegaard and pop culture. I'd love to get a Karl Barth and pop culture, and whatever theologian, religious thinker we can have. I'd love to get books like that. And then another direction I want to have is to have some books that address a specific discipline within theology. So right now I have a soteriology book that's under contract, a pneumatology book, an eschatology book. And so I'd like to get a few more of those that deal, that almost feel in some ways like they could be a part of a systematic theology subset or something, which they won't really be systematic because there are different authors doing them. So yeah, there's a lot of different stuff happening there that I'm excited about.
Awesome. Well, you wanted to talk a little bit about, you mentioned the Theology and Horror book. And how did you, since you've acknowledged that you're not really into horror, you're getting there maybe. Why the interest in doing that volume?
Because I'm intrigued by the idea of, at the very least, by the idea of horror. The theoretical idea of horror and what it signifies. We talked earlier about my buddy Donnie's piece.
Mm-hmm.
I've followed some of your stuff on Theofantastic, and followed some of those conversations that have happened there. Some of Scott Derrickson stuff and some of the interviews he's given. So I'm interested in the potential there. For me, it's more of a matter of finding the movies that are that really emphasize these sort of themes of enchantment, disenchantment, versus just like, watching Saw or something.
Right. Well, I appreciate the opportunity you mentioned it, I'm co-editing the book with Brandon Graffius. And in fact, we just started getting the initial submissions for us to start editing. And just so folks can know what we're talking about here, you approached me and asked if I'd be interested in editing, and we brought Brandon on as a co-editor. And I said I would if I can have a little leeway in terms of what we cover. One of my concerns is a lot of times when Christians get involved in writing on horror, it's usually connecting the dots between a particular understanding of a very conservative kind of faith to horror, which reaffirms what you've already presupposed theologically. And that certainly has its place, but that's just not what I'm interested in doing. I don't want to look for Christ figures in Saw or what have you. I'm not saying one's there, but I wanted to open those boundaries a little bit, and maybe even get, one of the things about horror is it's transgressive, it's subversive, and let's push the boundaries. Let's find out what can we do with theology, looking at horror a little more broadly. And you gave us the green light for that, thankfully. And we got some great submissions. I was, one of the things when you do call for papers, as you never know what you're going to get. Sometimes you hardly get anything and you're scrambling and you got to issue the call for papers 2 or 3 times. Sometimes you get a lot of submissions, you don't get anything of quality that you're looking for. So it's really, it's a crapshoot. And with this volume, we just got a number of submissions. I don't know why, but, I'll take it. And we had to tell a lot of people no, and we ended up with mostly PhDs, some doc students, some graduate students, doing some great subject, some not only male contributors, but female contributors.
I remember I specifically asked, I was like,
Yeah.
I got called out by a friend who was like, Matt, you cannot have an all-male book. I was like, fair. I agree.
Yeah, and I think we also had an email exchange about, we would like to get maybe non-Caucasian, and you said, what's that look like? And I said, I don't know, because people don't put that on the resume, right?
Right.
So I won't know, until the volume comes out. But I'm really pleased with what we've got here. We've got contributors like Doug Cowan, who's written a lot on horror. He's a sociologist. Steve Wiggins, who's going to be looking at the place of the Bible in influencing much of contemporary horror. So there's a lot of good stuff there, and I'm looking forward to jumping in and doing the co-editing here starting this month and going into September. So thank you for that opportunity. Appreciate it.
No, thank. And I'm always happy to, and for people listening, to throw open the boundaries and borders, so to speak. I always talk on other podcasts about how much I can't stand. And this is the problem with, I find a lot of these pop culture and theology books is, they do it's theology by analogy. So it's, when Superman fell from the sky with his arms outstretched, it's Jesus.
Right.
And like you said, that has a place. It's fine, but it's so uninteresting to me.
Right.
It is not very Theofantastic, one could say.
Well, and you're not going to find much of an audience for it. I mean, you're preaching to a very small choir, and so if you want to, I think publishers want readers, and you got to come up with an idea that can reach a broader audience. Under the Theology and Pop Culture series, do you have any open calls for submissions that you could use some more submissions to?
Yeah, I think the Theology and DC Universe one might be closing either this week. It might already close. I have to double check on that one. I know it was 2 weeks, a week and a half ago, so that one might be closed. There's a Theology and Batman one that's open that I'm co-editing with a friend of mine, Chuck Robertson, who did a chapter a number of years ago in Gospel According to Superheroes. The editor is BJ Oropeza, and it was a piece on Batman as Nietzsche's Übermensch.
Mm.
So the Superman. So I'm doing it with Chuck, who's a big Batman fan and like knows a lot of people in the comics world, and so that's going to be a good one. Which, Batman is horror in theology. If someone wink wants to write something on it, then that could be fun. And then I think that might be the only. There's always an open call for volume submissions, and the other submission that's open, but this is actually part of a different series, which I'm sure we can talk about in a second, is for Religion and Comics series that I'm doing through Claremont, which actually is really, what's cool about the Claremont series is they make it open source, they release it in paperback, they release it at a good price point, because the Theology and Pop Culture series, which I love doing, is they do that usual academic thing. It's released in hardcover, it's at a high price, and it takes about a year for it to get into paperback. With the Religion and Comics series, there's currently one open on Jinn and comics. So Jinn are these, those who are listening who might not know, they're these sort of intermediary spiritual beings. They're neither angels, neither are they demons. And within the Islamic tradition, they can convert to Islam and become, they can submit to the way, and they can, be part of the Ummah, and they can be a part of the Muslim community and form communities that follow the Quran. So Jinn and comics, I'm working on a piece right now actually on Swamp Thing as a Jinn. There are a few other ways you can go with that. I'm a big DC Comics fan, so all my ideas are DC. Things like Mixelplick and Batmite, these sort of fifth dimension imaginal beings. So that call's open, and I would, love contributors for that I'm doing with A. David Lewis.
Yeah. I'm still, my focus obviously now is on the Theology and Horror, but you and I have had some brief exchanges online about the possibility with the horror comics. That's still in the back of my mind. So you and I will continue to pursue that and see what might come about. Let's talk about the Religion and Comics series. That seems to be your first, I don't know if it's correct, your first love. Would you say it's kind of your major passion as the comics guy?
Yeah, comics are sort of like my area of pop culture, ultimate pop culture nerdiness.
Yeah.
And so I'm glad to be able to do and I'm glad Lexington let me do it, because there was some non-compete issues that came up. So,
okay.
They were like, yeah, and I was like, I don't want to undermine my own series here. So,
right.
But the Religion and Comics one is much more niche. It's very much comics. It's not about comics and other media. It's comics. Like, what is specific about this form? And I love comics. I love the stories. I have my different writers there. I love the crazy continuities and cosmologies that get created. And I think there's a lot to be said there about myth and theology and ontology and all these other really cool subjects that I think can get covered by it.
What do you think now that when I was a kid growing up in the 70s, I had friends who liked comics probably more than I did. I was always more into television, film, that kind of thing. But to find real pop culture nerds, it was tough. We didn't have the internet. I couldn't afford to go to they had very few conventions, back at that time. Now it's just mainstream. What are your thoughts? Happy about it, or are you welcoming the latecomers to finally get on board? Or
I'm happy about it, and I think I think it's overall a good thing. Unfortunately, as the stuff gets more commercialized, it's harder to like be in touch with the creators who are actually in charge of all this stuff. I've read some articles that kind of disturb me about some of the corporate overlords who own the IP tamping down on fans, doing fan type of stuff. There was the Rick and Morty bar in DC that got shut down. Even the Times Square guys dressing up as these pop culture people, like fans cosplaying, starting groups that involve, using this IP. Like for the most part, there's historically been this fan corporate understanding that has allowed it to happen. But I've been reading an article here and there about how kind of being afraid that some of these corporations will tamp down on any use of their IP, which sort of violates the spirit of why those laws exist, in my opinion. No one's claiming to have created this stuff, but you sort of have to let this corporate-owned myth be owned by the fans who are giving you the business. And I think I'm a little afraid of some of that stuff.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a challenge, especially when you've got fans. I don't know if did you see the battle of Paramount and Star Trek regarding some fans in a fan-based film that was put on the internet? Where they got a good amount of money, they hired actors, professional actors, and I watched it and I could not believe it. In my opinion, I love Star Trek, but I think some of the films have been of questionable value. And I thought this little short fan film, part of the concern of Paramount might have been this darn thing's better than what we produce with our feature-length films. So they clamped down on that. So it's interesting how fan production is coming up, and their intensity and passion is rivaling those that own the material that they're producing.
Yeah. In fact, there was I think that might have been the article I was reading about the corporate fan tension there might have actually been about that, or about, there was a similar Star Wars film, wasn't there, that
Probably.
that got tamped down, but then George Lucas stepped in and defended the fans. And that's good. Even though Phantom Menace is bad, it was still, I'm glad George still appreciates the fans in that way. So
let's talk. Can you give us some examples of a few titles that you've got coming into the Religion and Comics series?
Well, speaking of Star Wars, there is a Theology and Star Wars volume that is currently in the editing process. There's a Theology and Star Trek one. Speaking of that as well, that's in the editing process. Theology and Horror, obviously. I'm currently editing a volume on Game of Thrones. Unfortunately, the final season came out a little earlier than I hoped it would. There's a Marvel Universe volume that's actually now available for pre-order on Roman and Littlefield's website. And then along with that, this was supposed to be the first volume. We ran into some miscommunication issues between me and the volume editors, largely my fault. And also some issues getting an approved image for the cover for it from the Prince estate. But there's a volume on Theology and Prince coming out. And so there are a number of genre-specific volumes coming out also about certain figures and their work. James McGrath and I forget his co-author's name, but I'm friends with James, so that's why I remember him. He's doing one on progressive rock and theology. And I should actually say, I should be calling this Theology and Progressive Rock, Theology and Star Wars, because when I pitched the series to Lexington, I had already made up business cards and bought a domain name that said Pop Culture and Theology. And then they were like, hey, can we put the theology first? And I was like, I have 2,000 business cards. So, ouch. I'm trying to think of others, but those are some really big ones, and of course the Marvel and Prince ones are going to be available hopefully this December. And so it'll be nice to see, after about 2 years of all the prep work, all the recruiting coming about. Like I said, the Theology and Batman one, the Theology in the DC Universe, Rene Girard in pop culture, Soren Kierkegaard in pop culture, pneumatology in pop culture, soteriology in pop culture. All of these are at various country music, theology and country music. We have one volume on secular pilgrimage, this idea of spiritual pilgrimage transferring to pilgrimage to secular sites like Disney World and Fenway Park, and how visiting these places mirrors the pilgrimage that people used to take to holy sites and still take to holy sites, but less so in a secular world. So there's a lot of cool, diverse stuff coming out. There's a Westworld volume with Shana Schoenfeld and Julie Gittinger. that's coming out, so that'll be really exciting. So yeah, there's a Black Panther volume that is a little bit of a difficult birth. It's running into some delays, but I think that'll be a good one. Thankfully, the second movie is not coming out till 2022.
That's all sounds exciting. Anything else I haven't given you an opportunity to talk about that you want to mention?
No, I think that's it. Both of the book series, both are ongoing. Both. For the academics among us listening, you do need to have at least a master's to contribute. If you want to edit a volume and you have a master's, you probably need a co-editor with a PhD, something like that. But I'm always looking for volumes for both of these series. I'm always looking for blog contributions, and with the blog, anyone can contribute. I have some editors who generously donate their time for a recommendation. Is really all I can give. But yeah, I'm always looking for new contributions, volumes, editors, authors. So just if you have an idea, pitch it to me, and I'm more than happy to take a look. With the Religion and Comics series, I do have a co-editor, so it's not just me. It's A. David Lewis, who's a big guy in the religion and comics world, who's co-editing that with me because I don't have a PhD, so he does. So so I was like, David, can you help me out?
Where can folks get in touch with you and share abstracts, proposals?
They can email me at popandtheology@gmail.com. So POPANDTHEOLOGY. Is that how theology is spelled? Yeah, that's how theology is spelled.
And what's your website address?
Yeah, so I'm going to give the short one because you can go to www.popularcultureandtheology.com, or you can just go to www.andtheology.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on this podcast. And I look forward to continuing to work with you on the book and following your great website.
Thanks, John.